had been planning the trip for weeks, maybe even months. It was late summer, and the days were still long, warm, and bright, but I knew the nights in the higher parts of the forest would cool down sharply. I had hiked before, but usually on short trails that circled back to parking lots or campsites within a few hours. This time, I wanted something harder, something that would test me, something that would take me far from the safety of crowds and into a place where I could be alone with nothing but the sound of the wind, the birds, and the crunch of dirt beneath my boots. I studied maps for days, marking trails, checking distances, reading about elevation gain, and planning the water I would need to carry. I read about black bears in the area, about the warnings to keep food sealed, and about the way some sections of trail disappeared into overgrowth if not walked often. I was excited more than nervous. I packed carefully: food, water, my small stove, matches, flashlight, extra batteries, knife, a heavy jacket even though the daytime heat made it feel unnecessary. My backpack was heavier than what I usually carried, but I told myself it would be worth it for the challenge. The trail started out simple enough. A wide dirt path, packed down by the boots of many hikers, winding through tall trees where the sun broke in stripes across the ground. The air smelled like pine and dust, and the only sounds were the distant call of birds and the faint rush of water somewhere deeper in the woods. I walked steadily, finding my rhythm. My boots pressed into the soil with a dull thud, and sweat gathered along my hairline as I moved. After about 2 hours, I reached a fork in the trail. According to the map, the left path looped back toward more popular areas, but the right one cut deeper into the less traveled parts of the forest, eventually leading up into a ridge. I chose the right. The ground grew rougher, the dirt less packed, with roots jutting out and rocks that shifted slightly when I stepped on them. My pace slowed, but I felt good. I liked the challenge. By late afternoon, the trail narrowed further, sometimes only wide enough for one boot at a time, with thick shrubs brushing against my legs. The air felt heavier here, as though less wind managed to cut through. I had to push past branches, and every so often, I saw deer tracks in the dirt or the faint prints of smaller animals. The trail climbed steadily upward, and I could feel the strain in my legs, the burn of muscles I wasn't used to working this hard. When I finally stopped to rest, I sat on a flat rock overlooking a dip in the forest. From there, I could see how far I had come, layers of green hills folding out into the distance, with a faint haze above them. I drank water, feeling how dry my throat had become, and ate a protein bar that tasted like chalk but gave me energy. My shirt clung to my back, damp with sweat, and I could feel the first hint of soreness starting in my shoulders from the weight of the pack. I pushed on, determined to make it to the ridge before nightfall, but as the hours passed, I realized I had underestimated the distance. The trail grew steeper, and my pace slowed more than I had planned. The sun tilted low, turning the sky orange through the gaps in the trees. The light grew softer, dimmer, and I felt a gnawing thought I had tried to ignore all day. I might not reach the ridge before dark. When the shadows grew long and the forest dimmed into blue and gray, I admitted it. I needed to set up camp where I was. I found a small clearing beside the trail, not much larger than the size of a car, and cleared away sticks and rocks to lay down my tent. My hands shook slightly as I pushed the poles through and clipped the fabric into place, not from fear yet, but from the mix of exhaustion and the rush to finish before I lost all the light. When the tent was up, I crawled inside, laid out my sleeping bag, and cooked a small meal on my stove just outside. The flame flickered, throwing a faint glow against the dark trees. As night settled, the sounds of the forest grew sharper. Crickets sang in endless rhythm. Something small scurried through the dry leaves nearby. I ate quietly, every sound making me pause, but I reminded myself that animals were always here, and I was the visitor. I packed my food away in sealed bags and stuffed them into my backpack, which I kept zipped tight. I had read enough to know food left out could draw in bigger visitors I did not want. Lying in my sleeping bag, I tried to relax. The ground was uneven, pressing against my hip. My back ached, and the air grew colder quickly, seeping into the fabric of the tent. I could hear branches creak above me, leaves whispering against each other, and once in a while something heavier, a crack of a branch as though something had stepped on it. I told myself it was deer. I closed my eyes, but sleep came in short bursts. I would drift, then jerk awake at some sound outside, my heart pounding in the silence. When dawn came, pale light pushing through the thin walls of the tent, I felt relief. I packed quickly, eager to move again. My muscles were stiff, my shoulders sore, but the thought of reaching the ridge pulled me forward. The second day was harder. The trail rose sharply, with loose dirt that slid under my boots. My calves burned as I pushed upward. The trees thinned in places, and I could see glimpses of the valley far below. The sun beat harder here, with less shade to protect me. Sweat soaked my shirt, dripping into my eyes. I rationed my water carefully, realizing I was drinking more than I had planned. By afternoon, clouds gathered, thick and gray, rolling across the sky faster than I expected. The air cooled, and a low rumble of thunder carried across the hills. I quickened my pace, searching for some kind of shelter. When the rain came, it came hard, sheets of water slamming down through the trees, soaking me within seconds. The trail turned slick, mud clinging to my boots, rocks shining dangerously under the water. I slipped more than once, catching myself with my hands against the dirt. My backpack grew heavier as the rain soaked into it, dragging against my shoulders. I found a cluster of thick trees with enough cover to crouch under, but the rain poured through anyway. Lightning split the sky above, followed by thunder that shook the ground. The sound swallowed the forest, leaving no space for anything else. I waited, shivering, water dripping from my hair and sleeves, until finally, the storm began to ease. The rain slowed to a steady drizzle, then a soft patter, and the forest filled again with the sound of water dripping from every leaf. The trail was worse now. Mud pooled in dips, and my boots sank with each step. I was colder, wetter, and more tired than before. My food was safe, sealed in bags, but some of my spare clothes had soaked through in my pack. The idea of reaching the ridge felt far away, maybe too far. I kept going because there was no other choice. That evening, I didn't even bother to set up the tent. I found a flat enough patch under a wide pine tree, spread my tarp, and rolled into my sleeping bag still damp. I ate a little food, barely tasting it, and tried to sleep. The forest was louder tonight, as though the storm had stirred it up. Branches dripped constantly, and animals moved unseen in the wet undergrowth. I woke often, shivering, my bag damp against my skin. The next morning, I knew I was in trouble. My water was almost gone, and I had not seen a stream or spring since the first day. I knew the map showed one ahead, but I had misjudged distance before. My legs were heavy, my pack felt twice as heavy as when I started, and every step was harder than the last. My throat was dry, and my lips cracked. I pressed on, forcing myself to ignore the ache. The trail twisted, climbed, and then dropped sharply into a darker stretch of forest. The air here was cooler, shaded, but the ground was uneven, littered with rocks and roots. My boot caught on one, and I stumbled forward, slamming my knee into the ground. Pain shot through me, sharp and deep, and I had to sit there for a long moment, clutching my leg, breathing hard. The skin was torn, bleeding slightly, and the joint throbbed with every small movement. I wrapped it tightly with a strip of cloth from my pack and stood slowly, testing my weight. It hurt, but I could walk. Limping slower than before, I kept moving. Hours passed. My body felt broken, but my mind sharpened with one thought: water. Finally, I heard it, the faint sound of trickling. I pushed through thick brush and found a narrow stream running over rocks, clear and cold. I dropped beside it, filling my bottle, drinking deeply, the water washing away the dryness in my throat. I splashed my face, the shock of cold waking me again. Felt like survival, but I was behind schedule now, far behind. The ridge was still out of reach, and night would come again soon. My knees slowed me, every step painful, and my energy faded faster. I set up camp earlier, knowing I couldn't keep walking in the dark. That night was the worst. My knee throbbed, my body ached, and I couldn't get warm. The forest around me felt different, less like a place I was passing through and more like something pressing in on me, watching. I always thought I was careful when it came to hiking. I had been doing it for years, and I liked to believe I had enough experience to avoid most bad situations. I checked maps before heading out, kept a small first aid kit in my backpack, carried extra food and water, and usually stuck to marked trails. I was not careless, but sometimes you don't need to be careless for things to go wrong. Sometimes everything can fall apart because of one mistake, one miscalculation, or simply bad luck. That is exactly what happened to me one summer afternoon when I decided to take on a trail that was supposed to be simple, short, and manageable. It was early July, and the weather had been hot for days. I remember that the morning felt heavy, the air still and warm even at dawn. I left my small rented cabin around 6 in the morning, hoping to get an early start before the sun was too strong. The trail I had chosen was marked as moderate, about 9 miles in total, with steady but not steep inclines. It circled through a dense stretch of forest, looped around a ridge, and came back near the road where I had parked. The guidebook I carried described it as scenic but not difficult, the kind of hike people did in half a day. I packed what I thought was enough. My backpack had 3 bottles of water, 2 energy bars, a pack of trail mix, a rain jacket rolled up tight, a small flashlight, and a first aid pouch with basic supplies. I had my phone, fully charged, and a paper map folded neatly in a plastic sleeve. My boots were broken in, my socks dry and thick, my hat wide enough to block the sun. Everything seemed fine. I told myself this would be routine. The first few hours went smoothly. The trail was narrow but clear, winding between tall trees that blocked most of the direct sunlight. The ground was soft with pine needles, and I could smell the earthy scent of the woods, that mix of damp soil, resin, and fallen leaves. Birds were calling overhead, and every now and then I heard the rustle of some animal moving deeper into the brush. It felt peaceful, the kind of peace that comes when you are far enough away from roads and towns that you stop hearing cars, planes, or human voices. By mid-morning, I had made it past the first few miles, climbing higher up the ridge. The air was hotter now, and I felt sweat running down my back under the straps of my pack. I stopped to drink and check the map. Everything looked right. The trail matched the markings. I had been moving at a steady pace, nothing too rushed, nothing too slow. That was the last time the day felt normal. After another half hour or so, I came to a fork. The main path seemed to continue left, but there was another narrow way heading right. The signpost that should have marked the route was lying on the ground, the wood cracked and leaning. I crouched down to look at it, but the lettering had faded badly, and I couldn't tell which arrow had pointed where. I pulled out my map, trying to match the bends of the trail with what I saw around me. On paper, the trail should have kept left, looping gently up the ridge. The right path was not even marked. It looked less traveled, the dirt uneven, plants pushing into the edges. I hesitated only a moment, then turned left, convinced it was the right way. First it seemed fine. The ground sloped upward, the same as the map showed. But after a while, the path became thinner, less defined. I started to notice more fallen branches across the way, more rocks and roots jutting out. I told myself it was probably just a rougher section, that it would open up again. But the further I went, the less it looked like a maintained trail. After maybe 20 minutes, I was walking on what barely looked like a path at all. I stopped again and checked the map. Something wasn't right. According to the scale, I should have already reached a clearing that overlooked the valley. But there was no clearing, just more trees pressing close on both sides, the canopy above letting in only patches of sunlight. I tried my phone to see my GPS location, but the signal bars were faint and flickering. I waited, walked a few paces, lifted the phone higher. Nothing stable. That was the first moment I felt a chill of unease. I was not lost yet, but I knew I was headed in a direction that didn't match the plan. My instinct told me to turn back, retrace my steps to the fork, but I kept walking for another 10 minutes, thinking maybe it would bend back toward the ridge. Didn't. Kept going deeper, the ground dropping slightly now, pulling me downhill instead of up. I stopped again, frustrated, and finally admitted I had to go back. Turning around, I walked quickly, scanning for familiar signs, broken branches I remembered stepping over, roots I had seen before. But the woods were deceptive. Everything looked the same. After what felt like too long, I realized I had not come back to the fork at all. I had somehow veered off further. Panic started building in me, that creeping tightness in the chest that makes it hard to breathe evenly. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I had hours of daylight left. It wasn't even noon. If I stayed calm, I could get back. But every step I took seemed to make the forest around me thicker, denser, more tangled. The path beneath me disappeared until it was nothing more than faint pressed earth. Then even that faded into scattered leaves and brush. I was now officially off trail. The heat pressed heavier as the day climbed. I drank water more often, realizing with a jolt that I had already gone through more than one bottle. I slowed my pace, trying not to sweat so much, but it was useless. The air was stifling, and the effort of climbing over fallen logs and pushing through undergrowth made my shirt cling to me. By mid-afternoon, the panic had become a steady companion. I checked the sun, trying to judge direction. East was behind me, west ahead. I knew the road where I had parked was generally east, so I decided to keep walking that way. It seemed logical: go east, find the road, find the car. But the forest was not kind to straight lines. Slopes forced me sideways. Thick walls of brush turned me in arcs. Streams cut across my way. Every time I thought I was holding a direction, the land itself bent me another way. Hours passed like that. My legs were scratched from thorns. My arms stung from branches whipping against me. I rationed my water, but by evening I had only one bottle left. I chewed at my trail mix, forcing myself to eat even though my stomach was tight with stress. I tried my phone again, but the battery was slipping lower, the screen dim in the patchy signal. I turned it off to save power. As daylight began to fade, I faced the truth. I would have to spend the night in the woods. The thought terrified me. I had camped before, but always with a tent, a sleeping bag, a plan. Now I had nothing but what was in my pack. The forest around me was already darker, shadows stretching long, the air cooler with every minute. I found a spot against a thick tree trunk where the ground was at least flat. I cleared away sticks and leaves, made a rough seat for myself. I pulled on my rain jacket for extra warmth, though the air was still sticky with humidity. I sat there as night settled, listening to the sounds of the forest change. Birds went quiet, insects rose louder. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the snap of something moving through the brush. My heart pounded, every muscle tense, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. Sleep was nearly impossible. Every crack, every rustle made me jerk awake. At some point I dozed, only to wake with a stiff neck, the night dragging slow. My throat was dry, but I sipped water sparingly, knowing it had to last. I counted hours in the darkness, waiting for light. When morning finally came, the relief was sharp. The forest glowed gray, then gold, and I could see again. I was exhausted, my body sore, but I forced myself up and moving. I had to keep going. East, I reminded myself. Keep heading east. But the second day was worse. Heat rose faster. My legs felt heavier. The ground grew steeper in places, pulling me down into gullies, then up over ridges. I slipped more than once, catching myself on roots. Sweat soaked me until my clothes were wet. My last bottle of water was nearly gone by midday. When I drained it, I stared at the empty plastic and felt dread settle deep in my chest. By late afternoon, I stumbled onto a small stream. Relief flooded me so hard I almost cried. I knelt down, cupped water in my hands, and drank. The coldness against my tongue was life itself. I filled my empty bottle and carried it, though I knew untreated water carried risks. At that moment, sickness days later was better than dying of thirst now. That night was harder than the first. My body ached everywhere. I shivered even with the jacket, the damp air chilling my sweat-soaked clothes. Hunger gnawed at me, but I forced myself to eat the last of my trail mix. I thought of my cabin, of the road, of how close all of it might be, just miles away, yet unreachable. The forest around me felt endless, an ocean of trees. The third day, I moved slower. My head pounded. I stumbled often, catching myself on trunks. At one point, I thought I saw a trail ahead. I had been planning the trip for weeks. It was late summer, and the heat in the city had been unbearable. I needed a break, a chance to breathe clean air, hear the sound of water running over rocks, and see something other than concrete and traffic lights. Hiking had always been the way I cleared my head, but this time I wanted more than just a short walk near home. I wanted to get away, far into the hills where the air was cooler and the trails stretched for miles without anyone else around. I looked at maps, read online forums, and finally picked a route. It was supposed to be challenging but manageable. The trail wound up into the mountains, passed through a stretch of forest, crossed a few streams, and then circled back in a wide loop. It wasn't the most popular trail, which was exactly why I picked it. I didn't want crowds of people around me. I wanted silence, the kind of silence you can only get when you are miles from the nearest road. I packed carefully, a backpack with water bottles, energy bars, jerky, a light jacket, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, a pocket knife, and a whistle. I thought about bringing a tent and sleeping bag, but I wasn't planning to stay overnight, so I left them at home. My plan was simple: start early in the morning, take my time, and return before it got dark. The morning I set out, the air was already warm. The trailhead was about a 2-hour drive from my apartment, so I woke up before dawn, loaded my bag into the car, and set off while the streets were still empty. The drive itself was calming. The farther I got from the city, the more the scenery changed. Buildings gave way to rolling fields, then thick patches of trees, and finally steep hills in the distance. By the time I pulled into the small gravel lot at the trailhead, the sun had risen high enough to light everything in gold. There were only 2 other cars parked there. That reassured me. I wanted solitude, but not complete isolation. Knowing there were at least a couple of other hikers out there made me feel less like I was stepping into a world where no one could find me if something went wrong. I checked my backpack straps, tightened my laces, and started up the trail. First, it was easy. A gentle incline, a dirt path wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, and trees that filtered the sunlight into shifting patches of shade. The air smelled fresh, a mix of pine and damp earth. My body fell into rhythm quickly, the crunch of my boots on dirt matching the steady sound of my breathing. As the trail climbed, it narrowed. The trees grew closer together, and underbrush thickened on both sides. Every so often, I would hear the rustle of something moving. A bird taking off, a squirrel darting through leaves, maybe a deer in the distance. Those sounds didn't bother me. They belonged here. They were normal. After about an hour, I reached a point where the trail split. One way led up toward a ridge, the other dipped down into a valley. My map showed the loop I wanted followed the ridge, but curiosity got the better of me. I thought I remembered reading something online about a waterfall in the valley. It wasn't part of the official trail, but it didn't look far. I told myself I would just go a little way down, see what was there, and then come back to the main path. The descent was steeper than I expected. The dirt was loose in places, and I had to grab tree trunks or branches to steady myself. The farther I went, the quieter everything seemed to get. The air felt cooler, heavier, like I had stepped into a different pocket of the forest. I told myself that was normal. Valleys trapped shade and moisture. Still, I noticed the silence. No birdsong, no insects buzzing, just the sound of my boots and my breathing. After 20 minutes, I started to regret leaving the main trail. I hadn't seen any sign of water, and the slope had carried me much deeper than I planned. I pulled out my phone, but of course there was no service. The map I had saved didn't show this path, only the main loop. I should have turned back right then, but I told myself maybe just a little farther and I would see the waterfall. I hated the idea of climbing all the way back without at least confirming if it was there. Another 15 minutes passed before I finally heard it. A low, rushing sound, muffled but steady. I followed it and eventually came to a stream spilling over a rock ledge into a small pool below. It wasn't a huge waterfall, but it was pretty. The water sparkled in the sunlight that broke through a gap in the trees above. For a moment, I was glad I had come. I knelt, cupped cold water in my hands, splashed my face, and took a long drink from my bottle. That moment didn't last. When I stood up and looked around, I realized I had no clear sense of where the trail back was. The slope I had come down wasn't obvious anymore. From this lower ground, the forest looked different. Everything was just trees, undergrowth, and uneven ground. I tried to retrace my steps, but after only a few minutes, I felt uncertain. Had I come this way, or a little farther to the left? The unease settled in slowly. I told myself to stay calm, to think logically. If I kept heading uphill, I would eventually hit the main ridge trail again. That was true in theory, but uphill was not a straight line. The slope twisted, climbed, dipped, and split around rocky outcroppings. I picked a direction and started climbing. At first, I was confident. I moved steadily, scanning for any sign of a path. Flattened ground, broken branches, anything. But nothing looked familiar. The more I searched, the less certain I became. The trees pressed close, blocking out much of the sunlight. Time seemed to stretch, every minute feeling longer than the last. I stopped to catch my breath and drink more water. Sweat clung to my back and dripped from my forehead. When I checked my watch, I was surprised to see how much time had passed. I had been wandering uphill for nearly an hour, and I still hadn't reached the ridge. Worse, I hadn't found any trail. The thought hit me hard. I was lost. My chest tightened. I forced myself to stop and think. Panic would only make things worse. I still had daylight, food, and water. The main trail couldn't be too far. I just needed to keep my bearings. But as I pressed on, things got harder. The slope grew steeper. Rocks slid under my boots. Thick brush snagged at my clothes. Several times I slipped and had to grab at roots to stop myself from falling backward. My arms and legs ached. My throat felt dry no matter how much water I drank. After what felt like another hour, I reached a clearing. From there, I expected to see the ridge, maybe even catch a glimpse of the trail. But the trees stretched endlessly, and the land kept rising beyond what I could see. No sign of human passage, just wild, empty forest. A heavy knot formed in my stomach. I sat down on a fallen log, pulled off my backpack, and tried to calm myself. I ate a piece of jerky, but it tasted like cardboard in my dry mouth. I thought about blowing the whistle I carried, but I doubted anyone would hear it this deep. The sun had shifted. Shadows grew longer. I realized with dread that I might not make it back before nightfall. The thought of being out there in the dark, without a tent or sleeping bag, unsettled me. I had a flashlight, but batteries only lasted so long. I forced myself up and kept climbing, pushing through branches that whipped my arms and face. My legs trembled with each step. Every sound in the underbrush made me flinch. I imagined snakes, wild animals, even just the possibility of twisting an ankle with no one around to help. The forest seemed endless. By the time the sun dipped lower, the light turned orange and thin. I knew I wasn't going to find the trail before dark. That reality hit me harder than anything else had. I would have to spend the night out there, alone. I found a spot under a cluster of trees where the ground was relatively flat and cleared some leaves away. I pulled on my jacket, sat with my back against the trunk, and hugged my backpack to my chest. The sounds of the forest changed as the last light faded. Crickets began to chirp, owls hooted in the distance, and every so often, I heard something moving through the undergrowth. Each noise made my heart pound. I kept my flashlight ready, switching it on at the slightest rustle. Sleep didn't come. My body refused to relax. Every muscle stayed tense, my ears straining for sound, my eyes wide in the dark. The hours dragged on, each one colder than the last. At some point, exhaustion must have pulled me into a shallow, restless sleep, but it was broken by sudden noises, branches cracking, leaves crunching. Once I swore I heard heavy breathing nearby. I froze, clutching my knife, barely daring to move until silence returned. When dawn finally came, the relief was overwhelming. Pale light filtered through the trees, and I could see again. I forced down another energy bar, drank the last of one water bottle, and stood up on shaky legs. I decided to head in one direction and not waver. If I kept going long enough, I had to hit a road, a trail or something. The forest couldn't go on forever. Hours passed. My legs burned. My lips cracked with dryness. I rationed my remaining water carefully. I have always liked hiking, but most of the time I only went on short trails that didn't take more than a few hours. I was never one of those extreme hikers who set out for weeks at a time, but I liked the quiet and the way the world seemed different once you stepped away from the roads and houses. Over the years, I tried a few different trails in my state, and most of them were not too challenging. But one weekend, I decided I wanted something harder, something that would push me. I found a trail online that was supposed to be one of the toughest in the area. It ran along the side of a mountain range and cut across a narrow ridge that dropped steeply on both sides. People online wrote about how dangerous it could be, but also how beautiful the view was. I thought I was ready. I packed my bag carefully that morning. I brought water, some food, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and a light jacket. I thought I didn't need much because I was planning to be out and back before evening. I checked the weather forecast. It was supposed to be clear with maybe some clouds later in the day. I left early, parked my car near the trailhead, and started walking. The first stretch was not too bad. The trail went through woods with tall trees on both sides. The ground was a little muddy in spots, but nothing too bad. I heard birds above me and the sound of branches moving in the breeze. The air was cool, and for a while I felt excited. I liked the feeling of being alone, even though it made me a little nervous. After an hour or so, the trail started climbing. The trees grew thinner, and I could see more of the sky. The air felt lighter, and the path grew steeper. My legs started to ache, but I pushed forward. I stopped for water every once in a while, leaning against rocks to catch my breath. I noticed the trail was less used up here. The dirt looked untouched, and the plants on the side leaned into the path. It felt wilder, more remote. Then I reached the ridge. It was just as narrow as people had described online. The ground was no more than 3 feet wide in some places, and it dropped off sharply on both sides. On the left, the slope ran down to thick forest far below. On the right, the rock face plunged almost straight down into a valley. When I looked over the edge, I felt dizzy, so I tried to keep my eyes on the trail ahead. I slowed down, placing each step carefully. The ground here was made of loose stones and dust. Some of it shifted under my boots, and the sound of gravel sliding down the side of the mountain made my stomach turn. The ridge stretched on, twisting and turning with rocks jutting out. I thought about turning back, but I convinced myself to keep going. I told myself I would just go a little farther to see the view everyone talked about. The view really was something. When I stopped at one of the wider spots, I could see across the entire valley. Forests stretched for miles, broken up by patches of bare rock. Far off, I could see another ridge running parallel. The sky was pale blue with thin clouds drifting slowly. For a few minutes, I felt calm again, almost peaceful. Then I noticed the trail ahead. It narrowed even more. There was a section where the path cut across bare rock with nothing to hold on to. Just open sky and steep drops on both sides. My chest tightened. I thought about turning around right there, but I was already halfway across. I didn't want to go back over everything I had just crossed. I told myself I could make it if I took my time. I started across that bare stretch, leaning a little toward the slope, keeping my steps small and steady. The ground was dry and powdery, and each step sent tiny stones sliding over the edge. My heart beat faster and my mouth felt dry. I didn't look down. I just kept moving one step at a time. Halfway across, my foot slipped. The ground under me crumbled and I dropped to one knee. Loose rocks slid out from under me and clattered down into the valley. My stomach lurched, and for a second I thought I was going to fall. I froze there, pressed against the ridge, my fingers digging into the dirt. My breathing was fast and sharp. After a few long seconds, I forced myself to move again, crawling forward on hands and knees until I reached more solid ground. I sat there for a while, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking, and I felt weak all over. The ridge stretched on ahead, still narrow, but at least with some bushes and rocks to steady myself on. I thought about turning back again, but the idea of crawling back over that bare stretch where I almost fell made me sick. It felt like the only way was forward. I kept walking. The ridge twisted and climbed, sometimes dipping into small dips where the dirt was soft, sometimes rising up onto jagged rock. I had to use my hands often to steady myself. The sun was higher now, and the air felt warmer. Sweat dripped down my neck. After another hour, the trail widened a little. I stopped to eat some of the food I had packed, sitting on a flat rock. I tried not to think about the way back. I told myself maybe the trail looped around, even though I hadn't checked the map closely enough to be sure. As I ate, I noticed the sky was darker than before. The clouds that had been thin and harmless earlier were thicker now, rolling in from the west. The air felt heavier. I knew storms could come fast in the mountains, and I didn't like the look of it. I packed up quickly and started walking again. The trail dipped down from the ridge into a narrow cut between rocks. For a while, I felt safer with the walls on either side. But then the path climbed back up and I was exposed again. The wind was stronger now, pushing against me. Every time a gust came, I had to stop and steady myself. My legs were tired, and the pack on my back felt heavier than before. Rain started as I was crossing another open stretch of ridge. At first it was just a few drops, but then it came harder. The rocks grew slick, and the dirt turned to mud. My boots slipped more often, and I had to crouch low to keep from losing my balance. The wind howled, and the rain stung my face. I couldn't see the valley clearly anymore, just gray mist and sheets of water. I was scared now. I knew I had pushed too far. The storm made everything worse, and I wasn't sure I could get back across the ridge safely. The thought of being trapped up here made me panic. I kept moving, hoping to find some kind of shelter. The ridge sloped upward to a tall outcrop of rock. I climbed it slowly, my hands scraping against sharp edges. At the top, the wind nearly knocked me over. But on the other side, I saw a shallow cave set into the rock wall. It wasn't much, just a hollow space barely big enough to crawl into, but it was dry inside. I squeezed in and sat down, shaking from the cold and fear. The rain poured outside. The wind whistled through the rocks, and water streamed down the sides of the ridge. I sat there for a long time, hugging my knees to keep warm. My clothes were soaked, and I shivered. I ate the last of my food and drank some water, but I knew I didn't have much left. When the storm finally eased, the light was fading. I stepped out of the cave and saw the sky turning orange with sunset. Everything was wet and slippery. I knew I couldn't make it back across the ridge in the dark. I would have to stay the night there. I spent the night in that shallow cave. Couldn't sleep much. The ground was hard, and the wind blew cold air into the opening. I kept waking up, my body aching. Every sound outside made me tense up. Sometimes I heard rocks shifting, sometimes the cry of animals down in the valley. I felt small and helpless, trapped on that ridge. When the sky finally lightened, I crawled out and looked around. The storm had passed, but the ground was still wet. Mist hung low over the valley, and the ridge looked even more dangerous than before. I knew I had to move. I started back slowly, taking each step with care. The wet rocks made it harder than the day before. My boots slipped often, and I had to crouch low, gripping at bushes and cracks in the rock. My hands were raw from scraping against stone. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to keep going. When I reached the bare stretch where I had almost fallen the first time, I froze. The rock was slick, and there was nothing to hold on to. My stomach twisted. I crouched low and tried to crawl, but halfway across my foot slipped again. My whole body slid toward the edge, and I slammed onto my side. Loose stones rattled down into the mist below. My fingers clawed at the ground, scraping against sharp edges until they caught on a crack. My chest heaved as I pulled myself back up. My arms shook so hard I thought they would give out, but I kept crawling until I reached solid ground. I lay there for a long time, breathing hard, my heart pounding. My palms were cut open, bleeding. My knees were bruised, but I was still alive. The rest of the hike back felt endless. Every step took all the strength I had left. My mouth was dry, and I had little water left. The sun rose higher, burning away the mist, but the heat made me feel weaker. My pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Hours later, I finally saw the trees thickening again. The ridge sloped down into forest, and the path grew wider. When I stepped into the woods, I almost cried with relief. The ground felt steady under my boots, and the air was cooler. I have always liked hiking alone, even though most people would call it careless or even stupid. To me, walking alone through the woods or up a mountain trail has always been a way of emptying my head. I never liked the idea of rushing with a group, trying to keep up with people who had different paces, or pretending to enjoy small talk when all I wanted was silence. Out there, away from roads and houses, I could hear my own breathing, the crunch of dirt and gravel under my boots, and the wind pushing through the branches. It made me feel small, but in a way that was calming. I had done plenty of short-day hikes before, but this time I wanted something harder, something that would push me a little further. I chose a long trail that went through rough terrain and climbed up into a mountain range that people around town warned was not for beginners. I thought I was ready. I had been training by walking several miles every day, carrying a heavy pack to get used to the weight. I bought new boots, a large water bladder, dried food, a first aid kit, and a strong headlamp. I studied the map for days and marked the trail with notes. The plan was to hike all day, camp overnight somewhere near the ridge, and hike down the next morning. The day I set out, the air was cool and clear. It was late summer, but up in the mountains, the mornings always started cold. I parked my car at the small dirt lot near the trailhead, tightened my laces, and set off. The path started wide, almost like a dirt road, with tall grass on both sides. The sun came up slowly over the tree line, throwing long shadows across the ground. I felt strong, even a little proud of myself, thinking about how I had prepared so well. The first several miles were steady uphill, but nothing too hard. The ground was dry and packed down from other hikers, though I didn't see anyone else that morning. I passed wooden trail markers nailed to trees, each one pointing toward different forks in the path. I followed the one with the red mark, just as I had studied on the map. After a couple of hours, I stopped near a stream, filled my bottle, and ate a handful of trail mix. Everything felt right, but as I kept climbing, the trail narrowed. The ground grew rockier, and the trees spread further apart, letting in more sunlight. The air was thinner up there. My legs burned with each step, but I told myself that pain meant I was pushing myself. Eventually, I reached a part of the trail where the ground was loose and steep. It was covered in gravel that slid under my boots each time I put weight on it. On one side, the slope rose sharply into thick bushes. On the other, it dropped away into a steep hillside covered with broken rocks and fallen logs. I remember stopping and looking at that section. It wasn't very long, maybe 50 or 60 feet, but it looked dangerous. The trail was only a couple of feet wide, and one wrong step would send me sliding down. I thought about turning back, but I had already come so far, and I hated the idea of quitting. I tightened the straps on my pack, leaned slightly toward the hill, and started across. The first steps were fine. I pressed my boots hard into the gravel, making sure I had some grip before shifting my weight. My heart beat faster, but I kept moving. Then, near the middle of the narrow stretch, the gravel gave out under my left foot. My body slid sideways, and for a split second, I thought I was going to fall. I threw myself against the slope, digging my hands into the dirt and rocks. My knees slammed into the ground, and sharp pain shot up my leg. I lay there, frozen, breathing hard. When I looked down at the drop below, I saw how far I could have gone. It took me several minutes to steady myself and crawl the rest of the way across. When I reached wider ground, I sat down and checked my leg. My jeans were torn at the knee, and a thin line of blood ran down my shin, but it wasn't deep. I wiped it off, wrapped it with a strip of gauze from my kit, and tried to convince myself it wasn't serious. Still, the scare stayed with me. For the first time, I thought about how alone I really was out there. If I had fallen and broken something, no one would have found me for days. I almost turned back then, but pride pushed me forward again. I told myself that if I could get to the ridge and set up camp, the worst part would be over. I would hike down tomorrow and feel accomplished. So I kept climbing. The higher I went, the rougher the trail became. It twisted through boulders and patches of thorny brush, forcing me to use my hands to pull myself up at times. My pack felt heavier with every step. Sweat soaked through my shirt, and the straps rubbed raw spots into my shoulders. The sky had turned gray with thin clouds, and a cold wind blew down from the ridge. By the time I finally saw the top, my legs felt like they might give out. When I reached the ridge, the view should have been rewarding, but all I felt was tired. The land dropped away on both sides, showing endless layers of hills and valleys. The sun was already sinking low, and the light looked orange and weak. I set down my pack and pulled out the small tent I had carried. I found a flat spot between two large rocks, cleared away sticks, and set it up quickly before the wind got worse. Once camp was ready, I sat on a rock and ate a cold meal from a foil pouch. I drank water and forced myself to relax, but my body ached everywhere. The cut on my leg stung when I bent my knee. I wanted to rest, but the air kept getting colder, and the wind whistled across the ridge. I crawled into the tent, zipped the flap shut, and lay inside my sleeping bag. At first, the sound of the wind was steady, almost soothing. But as night came, the gusts grew stronger. They whipped against the thin walls of the tent and rattled the poles. Every time I closed my eyes, a new noise snapped me awake. A rock tumbling somewhere down the slope, branches scraping together, the sharp crack of something breaking in the distance. I told myself it was just nature, but it was impossible to relax. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps. They were faint at first, crunching in the gravel near the ridge. My body froze in place, and my breathing went shallow. I listened harder, trying to decide if it was just the wind shifting rocks around. But then I heard it again. Slow, heavy steps moving closer. I didn't move. I didn't even unzip the tent to look. The thought of another person up there at that hour felt wrong. The trail had been empty all day. Who would climb that ridge in the dark? My stomach twisted as I imagined someone standing just outside, waiting. The steps went on for several minutes, sometimes fading, sometimes returning closer. Then finally they stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too afraid to sleep. When morning finally came, I unzipped the tent and looked around. The ridge was empty. The ground around my tent showed no clear footprints, just the scuffed gravel from when I had set up camp. Maybe I had imagined it, or maybe the wind had played tricks. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I packed quickly, eager to leave. Going back down was supposed to be easier, but with sore muscles and less energy, every step felt harder. The narrow section of trail with the drop terrified me on the return. My boots slipped twice, and I had to crouch low to keep balance. When I finally crossed, my hands were shaking. Hours later, when the trail widened again and the trees grew thicker, I felt relief. I thought the worst was behind me, but then I noticed something strange. A pile of rocks sat at the side of the path. At first, I thought it was natural, but as I looked closer, I realized it had been built by hand. The stones were stacked neatly into a small tower, about knee-high. I hadn't seen it on the way up. Someone must have made it after I passed. My stomach tightened again. As I continued, I saw another pile a little further down, then another. Each one was carefully stacked, always on the edge of the trail, almost like markers. They hadn't been there the day before. Someone had followed the same path after me, leaving them behind. By then, every sound in the woods made me jump. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, even the call of a bird set me on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone coming down the trail behind me. But I never did. When I finally reached the bottom, the relief hit me like a wave. My car was still there in the dirt lot, untouched. I threw my pack inside, climbed into the seat, and locked the doors. Only then did I let myself breathe fully again. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps on the ridge and the rock piles that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was just another hiker, someone who liked leaving markers for fun. Maybe the footsteps were just rocks shifting in the wind. But the timing, the silence, the careful stacks along the trail, It all felt too deliberate. I told myself I had been lucky. Lucky not to fall, lucky not to meet whoever might have been out there. I realized then how unprepared I truly was. Maps, gear, and food meant nothing compared to the reality of being alone in the wilderness with no one to call for help. I never hiked that trail again. I had been planning the hike for weeks. The trail I chose wasn't famous or tourist-heavy. It was a ridge path that cut through miles of thick forest and eventually opened onto a plateau with views stretching across valleys and mountains. The guidebook described it as strenuous but rewarding, and I liked that description. I had done plenty of hikes before, but I wanted to push myself a little further this time, to go somewhere where I wouldn't constantly bump into people. I started early in the morning. The air was cool, damp with dew, and the smell of pine needles was heavy as I parked my car at the gravel pull-off near the trailhead. The dirt path looked like it had been there forever, cut deep into the ground by boots and water. I strapped on my pack, checked that I had water, food, a flashlight, a map, and a small first aid kit, then stepped into the trees. The forest was quiet, just the sound of my boots crunching on rocks and dirt, and the occasional creak of branches overhead. Sunlight filtered through in narrow strips, leaving most of the woods in a green-brown shade. The first mile or so was steady uphill, enough to get my heart going. My shirt started to cling to my back with sweat even though the air was still chilly. I kept a slow, steady pace, making sure not to wear myself out too early. After a while, I noticed how empty it felt. No voices, no distant sounds of cars or towns. Just me and the forest. I thought I liked it at first. That's why I came here, to be away from everything. But as the trail kept pulling me deeper, the silence started to feel heavier. I reminded myself that people used this trail. There were boot prints in the dirt, scuff marks on rocks. I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. The trail began to narrow as it climbed higher, forcing me closer to the edge where the hillside dropped away. I kept glancing down at the slope, imagining what it would feel like to slip. The ground was covered in loose pine needles and stones that shifted when I stepped on them. My boots held, but I couldn't shake the thought that one wrong step could send me tumbling. I adjusted my balance and kept going. Hours passed. My thighs ached, and my breathing was harder, but I pushed on. The forest started to thin out in places, and I could see glimpses of the valley below. A river wound its way through, glinting in the sunlight, and far in the distance the tops of mountains were covered in snow even though it was late spring. When I reached a flat section, I stopped to rest. I sat on a fallen log, drank water, and chewed on a protein bar. My legs trembled slightly from the climb, but I knew I still had a long way to go. I checked the map. The plateau wasn't supposed to be reached until around mile 10, and I was maybe at mile 5 or 6. I continued on, deeper into the ridge trail. That's when the path grew narrower and rougher. Roots stuck up across it like twisted ropes, and big stones jutted out where the dirt had washed away. It forced me to slow down, step carefully, and sometimes use my hands to balance. At one point, I came across an old wooden sign nailed to a tree. The paint was faded, but I could just barely make out the words warning hikers of steep terrain and advising them to stay on the marked trail. The red arrow pointed straight ahead. I thought it was odd how old and weathered the sign looked, almost forgotten, but I kept going. The higher I went, the stranger it felt. The silence wasn't just empty anymore. It was pressing. No birds, no rustling of animals in the underbrush. Nothing. It was like the forest was holding its breath. My own footsteps sounded too loud, and every time I stopped, the absence of sound made my ears ring. The trail took a sharp turn and hugged the side of a cliff wall. There was barely enough room for me to walk, maybe 2 feet across, with the cliff face on one side and a steep drop on the other. My stomach tightened as I edged along, keeping my hand against the rock for balance. The dirt crumbled a little under my boots, tumbling down into the trees far below. After that section, the path widened again, but I couldn't relax. My nerves were raw. I realized just how far from everything I was. No cell signal, no quick way back. If something went wrong, I would be stuck. I tried to shake the thought, reminding myself I had prepared well, but it lingered in the back of my mind. I kept climbing. The sun had moved higher, and the shadows had shifted. My shirt was damp, and the straps of my pack dug into my shoulders. I took another break under a tree, sitting on the cool ground. As I sat there, I noticed something odd. On the side of the trail, near a cluster of rocks, there was an old boot. Just one, weathered, cracked, and covered partly in moss. It looked like it had been there for a long time. I stared at it longer than I should have. Why would just one boot be left there? Had someone dropped it? Had it belonged to someone who never came back? I didn't want to think about that, so I forced myself to get up and keep moving. The trail began to switch back up a steeper incline, and that's when I noticed the sky darkening. Not from clouds, but from the angle of the ridge. The trees blocked most of the sunlight now, and the path grew cooler, damper. I could feel the air change. My breathing echoed strangely in the tight, enclosed space. That's when I made my mistake. I missed a turn. The path split, one section going uphill sharply, the other bending slightly downward. The marker on a tree was worn away, and in my fatigue I chose the wrong way. At first I thought I was fine. The trail looked used enough, the dirt packed down. But after 10 minutes, the ground grew rockier, and the path narrowed to almost nothing. Branches clawed at my arms, and the slope grew steeper. I realized I wasn't on the main trail anymore. My stomach dropped. I stopped and looked around, trying to figure out how far I'd gone. Everything looked the same: trees, rocks, more trees. I turned back, retracing my steps, but the trail I had just walked on seemed to vanish behind me. The dirt blended with the forest floor, and I couldn't tell where the real path had been. I felt panic rising in my chest. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to think. I pulled out the map, but it was useless. It only showed the official trail, not the hundreds of animal tracks and false paths that branched off it. I decided to go uphill. I thought if I could get higher, I might see the ridge or spot the plateau. The climb was brutal. The slope was covered in loose dirt and stones that slid under my boots, and I had to grab at roots and branches to keep myself from slipping. My arms grew scratched and raw. Sweat dripped into my eyes, stinging. When I finally reached a flatter section, I stopped to catch my breath. My chest burned, and my legs shook. I turned, expecting to see a view of the valley, something that could help me orient myself. But all I saw was endless forest in every direction. That was when the fear hit hard. Real fear, the kind that makes your hands shake and your thoughts scramble. I was lost, truly lost. I forced myself to keep calm. I had food, water, supplies. If I stayed smart, I could get back. I pulled out my compass, checked my bearings, and decided to keep moving north. The trail had generally gone north, so I figured if I kept that direction, I might reconnect with it. Hours passed like that. My feet ached. My throat was dry no matter how much water I drank. I stumbled over roots, slid down small slopes, tore the skin on my palms catching myself. My pack felt heavier with every step. At one point, I heard something behind me, a snapping branch. My heart leapt, and I spun around, but there was nothing, just trees. I told myself it was probably a deer or some animal, but it kept me on edge. I started glancing back every few minutes, half expecting to see something following me. The sun was lowering now, shadows stretching long across the ground. I knew I had to think about where I would spend the night. The thought made my stomach turn. I hadn't planned on staying overnight. I had no tent, no sleeping bag, just the basics. But wandering blindly in the dark would only make things worse. I found a small flat area between two large rocks, somewhat sheltered from the wind. I dropped my pack and sat heavily, my whole body aching. I ate another bar, sipped the last of one bottle of water, and sat there as the forest grew darker around me. The sounds changed at night. Insects started up, shrill and constant, and every now and then I heard distant rustling. I sat with my flashlight clutched in my hand, the beam cutting small holes into the dark. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Every shadow looked like it was moving. Every noise made my heart jump. Sleep didn't come easy. I drifted in and out, jerking awake every time a branch cracked or a gust of wind rustled the leaves. My body shivered in the cold, and I curled tighter into myself for warmth. When the sky finally lightened, I pushed myself up, sore and stiff. My mouth was dry. I knew I had to find water. I remembered the river I had seen far below earlier in the day. If I could get down to it, I could refill. So I started downward, picking my way through the thick forest. It took hours, maybe half the day, but eventually I heard it, the faint sound of running water. I had been planning the hike for weeks. The idea of walking through deep forest trails far from towns or busy roads had been pulling at me for a while. I wanted to test myself, to get away from the noise and the routines I had grown tired of. I picked an old route I found marked faintly on a map, one that was said to be little used anymore. The trail started at a known path but eventually curved away into sections that few people bothered to take. From what I could gather, it had been popular decades ago, but newer and easier routes had taken over. That was what made it so appealing to me. The morning I set out, the air was damp and cool. The sky was still heavy with the last of night. My backpack felt solid on my shoulders. Inside, I had packed the basics: food, water, a map folded carefully, a compass, a flashlight, an emergency blanket, and a small knife. I had checked each item more than once, not because I doubted myself, but because I knew I had to be sure. I was alone, and mistakes would be mine alone to fix. The first part of the hike was easy. The trail was wide enough to see clearly, and the ground was firm. Trees lined both sides, tall pines mixed with thinner birches, their leaves turning yellow and gold with the season. Birds called from the canopy. The smell of pine needles and damp earth rose up with each step. I moved at a steady pace, feeling the rhythm of my boots on the ground. After about 2 hours, I reached the split where the old path turned away. The main trail continued straight, smooth and well-trodden, but the one I wanted slanted off to the right. It was narrower, darker, and already looked less inviting. The trees closed in, and the grass grew taller along the edges. A weathered wooden post still stood there, its paint peeling, but no sign or marker was left on it. It felt like a forgotten doorway into another place. I stepped onto it. The air seemed quieter. Even the birdsong thinned out. I pressed on, curious and excited. The trail wound between thick undergrowth, the path soft and sometimes muddy beneath my boots. Fallen branches lay across it, and more than once I had to climb over or push aside brush that had grown into the way. It felt wild, as if I was slipping deeper into a place where people had not walked for a long time. After another hour, I stopped for a drink and pulled out the map. The trail was marked faintly, with dotted lines where it grew unclear. I knew if I followed it closely enough, I would eventually loop back toward the main path, though it would take much longer. That was the plan. I wanted to spend the day out there, testing myself. I continued, but the deeper I went, the more the path seemed to fade. Sections of it were overgrown so badly that I had to guess where the trail had once been. The ground grew uneven, sloping sharply at times, covered in loose rocks and roots that caught my boots. Sweat gathered on my back despite the cool air. My legs began to feel the weight of constant climbing and balancing. At one point, I slipped. My foot landed on a damp patch of moss and slid out from under me. I fell sideways and caught myself on a tree trunk, scraping my arm against rough bark. The sting of it reminded me of how quickly things could go wrong out there. I stood still for a while after that, breathing, listening. The forest was silent except for the faint rustle of leaves above. I wiped dirt off my hands and kept going, but I noticed I was walking more carefully now. By midday, the light had shifted. The sun was higher but hidden by thick branches overhead. The forest floor looked dim, covered in patches of shadow. I found a small clearing and sat down to eat. I chewed slowly, sipping water between bites, my eyes scanning the trees around me. They stood close, straight and tall, like endless walls. I couldn't see very far in any direction. I thought about how easy it would be to get lost if I strayed even a little from the faint line of the trail. When I set off again, I noticed the air felt cooler, heavier. Clouds must have been moving in above the canopy. The ground became softer, wetter. My boots squelched with each step. Soon, the trail narrowed until it was little more than a strip of slightly pressed earth. The brush pressed against my legs, scratching my pants. Branches hung low, forcing me to duck often. Hours passed this way. My body grew tired, but I pushed on, focused on reaching the point where the trail should curve back. I checked the map again, squinting at the faint dotted lines. I tried to match the bends in the ground to the marks on the paper, but it was hard. The terrain never seemed to match exactly. That small doubt began to creep in, the thought that maybe I had already gone too far off the right track. I kept moving, trusting my compass and the direction I believed I should be going. But the trail grew worse. At times, it vanished completely, and I had to search for the next sign of it. A patch of trampled earth, a break in the brush, a line of stones that seemed unnatural. Each time I found what I thought was the trail, I followed it, hoping it would lead back. But deep down, I knew I was wandering further into something I didn't fully understand. As the afternoon wore on, the forest grew darker. The clouds above thickened, and a damp wind moved through the trees. I realized I hadn't seen any sign of people all day. No footprints, no broken branches that looked fresh. Nothing that suggested anyone had walked there in years. The weight of that thought sat heavy on me. Then I heard it, the faint crack of a branch breaking somewhere in the distance. I froze. My heart thumped hard in my chest. For a long moment, I stood perfectly still, straining my ears. At first, there was only silence. Then, faintly, another sound. A soft movement, like something brushing against leaves. I told myself it was an animal. The forest was full of them. Deer, maybe, or something smaller. But the sound had a weight to it, a pattern that made my skin prickle. It wasn't the quick scurry of a rabbit or the flutter of a bird. It was heavier, slower, almost measured. I started walking again, faster this time, my boots crunching on the uneven ground. I glanced behind me more often, each time seeing only trees and shadow. But every so often, I thought I heard it again. A faint crack, a shift of weight on leaves, always behind me, always far enough that I couldn't see. My chest felt tight. I pushed harder, ignoring the ache in my legs. The trail dipped downward into a shallow ravine, where the ground was damp and covered in moss. I slipped again, catching myself on a branch, my breath loud in my ears. I looked back, scanning the slope behind me, but there was nothing there, just trees, still and silent. I climbed out of the ravine and pressed on. The air felt heavier now, the kind of pressure that comes before rain. The sky above the branches was a dull gray. I realized it would be dark sooner than I had planned. My stomach tightened at the thought of being stuck there after sunset. I kept walking, trying to move faster without losing the faint path. But no matter how far I went, the sense of being followed stayed with me. Sometimes I thought I heard two steps, close together, then silence. Sometimes it was a faint rustle that seemed to stop the moment I did. Each time, I turned sharply, scanning the forest, but saw only trunks and shadows. Eventually, I stopped. My legs were burning, my throat dry. I stood still, forcing myself to listen carefully. For a long time, there was nothing, just the wind moving through the trees. Slowly, I convinced myself it had been my imagination, or maybe distant animals moving through the brush. I pulled out my map and tried again to find where I was. But the lines and marks on the paper made less sense now. I had gone too far. The realization hit hard. I was lost. I folded the map slowly, my fingers trembling slightly. I tried to calm myself by breathing steadily. I still had my compass, still had daylight left. I could pick a direction and keep moving until I reached something familiar. A road, a river, anything. I chose west, the direction that should eventually bring me back toward the main trail. I adjusted my pack and started walking straight, no longer worrying about following the faint path. I pushed through brush, stepped over roots, and tried to ignore the way the forest seemed endless. But the sounds returned, soft, faint, always behind me. Each time I stopped, they stopped. Each time I hurried, they matched. My skin prickled with cold sweat. I turned sharply more than once, my eyes searching the spaces between trees. And once, just once, I thought I saw something, a faint shape, low and quick, slipping behind a tree trunk far back. My heart hammered. I told myself again it was an animal, maybe a deer startled by my movement. But the fear in my chest didn't ease. The light dimmed further. The forest turned gray, then darker, as shadows stretched long across the ground. I knew I wouldn't make it out before nightfall. My only choice was to keep moving until I couldn't anymore, then find a place to wait out the night. The thought made me sick with dread, but stopping in the middle of the forest with no I had been hiking for years, and most of the time I thought of myself as careful. I planned routes, carried the right gear, checked maps, studied the weather, and gave myself plenty of daylight. But the mountains have a way of cutting through that confidence. I learned that the hard way on one hike that started out as something simple and turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. It was late September, and the air had already started cooling down in the higher elevations. The leaves on the trees at the lower part of the trail were still hanging on to a green shade, but higher up, some of them had already turned orange and yellow, with patches of bare branches against the sky. The ground was covered with a thin layer of fallen leaves that crunched beneath my boots as I walked. The plan was straightforward. A day hike into the mountains, up one of the less used trails that looped around a ridge and circled back to the parking lot. The guidebook estimated the loop at around 14 miles, which I thought I could manage with enough time to spare before dark. I had hiked longer before, though usually on better marked trails. I had a backpack with water, food, a flashlight, an extra shirt, a rain jacket, and a paper map of the area folded neatly in a plastic sleeve. My phone had a GPS app, but I never trusted batteries in the wilderness, so I kept the map as my main tool. I also carried a small knife and a whistle, though I hoped I'd never need them. The first miles passed easily. The trail was narrow but clear, and I could hear the sound of running water in the distance from time to time. I stopped near a stream about 4 miles in, knelt down to splash my face with the icy water, and kept moving. My legs felt strong, and the cool air made the hike more pleasant than summer trips where sweat soaked through my clothes. The farther I went, the less maintained the trail looked. Fallen branches blocked parts of the path, and the grass grew tall on both sides. I noticed that the trail markers, little rectangles of paint on tree trunks, became less frequent. Sometimes I had to stop and search for the next mark before continuing. At around the 6th mile, I reached a steep section where the trail climbed sharply up a slope of loose rock and dirt. My boots slipped several times, and I had to dig my trekking pole into the ground to steady myself. By the time I got to the top, my thighs burned, and my breathing came heavy. I rested there for a few minutes, drinking from my water bottle and eating a granola bar. From that spot, the view stretched out over miles of forest, with ridges rolling one after another into the horizon. The sky was still clear, though a few thin clouds had started to move in from the west. I figured I had plenty of time, so I continued on, following the ridge line. But the trail seemed to grow fainter the farther I went. First, I noticed it was less worn. Then it seemed more like a deer path than a real hiking trail. At one point, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker for almost half an hour. I pulled the map out of my pack and unfolded it. According to the map, the loop should have turned slightly left along the ridge, but the path I was on looked like it went straight ahead. I walked back a few minutes, searching for the turn I might have missed. I found a faint fork where the ground was covered in leaves. The correct trail must have been the one hidden there. Relieved, I pushed on, but even this new path didn't feel right. The slope grew steeper, and the trail was so faint that sometimes I only guessed where it might have been. The first wave of unease hit me then. I had been so focused on moving forward that I hadn't kept close track of the landmarks. Every tree and rock began to look the same. I told myself I wasn't lost yet, but deep down I knew I was close. I checked my watch. It was already past 2 in the afternoon. Sunset in late September came early in the mountains, and I had at most 3.5 hours of light left. I needed to make a decision. Either push ahead and hope the trail looped back like the map showed, or turn around and retrace my steps. I chose the second option, thinking it was safer. Walking back, I kept scanning for trail markers, but everything looked different in reverse. I tried to match the turns in the trail to what I remembered, but the leaves on the ground blurred the line of the path. At one point, I came to a small clearing where 3 faint paths seemed to branch off, none of them clearly marked. I picked the one that seemed most worn, but after 20 minutes, I realized it was leading me downhill into a ravine I didn't recognize. That was when the panic started to set in. My throat tightened, and my stomach felt hollow. I tried to calm myself, telling myself to think slowly, to breathe. I decided to climb back up and return to the clearing, but by the time I did, the light had shifted. Shadows stretched longer between the trees, and I couldn't even be sure I had found the same clearing again. The forest grew thicker, and the sound of wind in the branches drowned out everything else. Every snapping twig made me flinch. I knew I had to face the possibility that I was lost. Not just a little off track, but truly lost. I pulled out the map again, but without a clear landmark, it was almost useless. The ridges all looked similar, and the streams marked on the map could have been any of the small trickles I crossed. My phone still had signal, but no service bars, and the GPS app kept freezing. The air grew colder. I put on my extra shirt and jacket, zipped them up tight, and kept moving, hoping to find something familiar. But the more I walked, the more uncertain I became. The ground grew uneven, covered in rocks and roots. I stumbled several times, once catching myself on a tree at the last second to avoid falling. As the light faded, I knew I had to think about shelter. Spending the night in the forest hadn't been part of the plan, but it was my reality now. I found a cluster of thick trees that blocked some of the wind and cleared a space beneath them. I laid down a layer of dry leaves and sat on top of them to insulate myself from the ground. I ate another granola bar and drank water sparingly, knowing I might need it for longer than I had planned. The darkness closed in fast. Without the sun, the forest felt alive in a different way. Every sound stood out sharply. The rustle of leaves, the cracking of branches, the distant call of an animal I couldn't identify. I turned on my flashlight, but I used it sparingly, worried about draining the batteries. The hours dragged. Couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined footsteps approaching, though I knew it was only my mind playing tricks. At one point, I thought I saw movement between the trees, a dark shape shifting, but when I shined the flashlight, nothing was there. The night was long and bitterly cold. I shivered hard, my teeth chattering. My legs cramped from sitting curled up. I kept checking my watch, counting down the hours until dawn. Finally, the sky began to pale. I got up stiffly, stretched, and tried to warm my body by walking in circles. My stomach growled. I ate a handful of trail mix, careful not to finish it all. In daylight, things didn't look much better. I was still surrounded by endless trees, with no clear path, but at least I could see. I decided to head downhill, reasoning that most trails eventually led to streams or rivers, and rivers often led to roads or towns. The descent was rough. The ground was damp, and moss made the rocks slippery. At one point, I slipped and slid several feet before catching myself against a log. My palms were scraped raw, and my ankle throbbed where I twisted it, but I could still walk. By late morning, I reached a small stream. I refilled my water bottle and followed it downstream. The sound of water was a strange comfort, something steady in the middle of chaos. I walked for hours, crossing slippery stones and ducking under branches. But the stream twisted and split into smaller branches, confusing me again. I tried to keep to the larger flow, but it often disappeared under rocks, leaving me guessing. My energy drained, and my legs felt heavy. By afternoon, clouds thickened overhead, and soon light rain began to fall. I pulled my rain jacket on, but it did little against the damp chill. The forest grew darker again, even though it was only midday. I pushed on, knowing I needed to cover as much ground as I could before nightfall. Hours later, just as despair began to sink deeper, I spotted something. A faint line cutting across the trees at an angle too straight to be natural. I scrambled toward it, heart racing, and found what looked like an old logging road, overgrown with grass but still recognizable. Relief flooded through me. Roads usually led somewhere. I followed it, limping slightly from my sore ankle. The road twisted down the slope, and after what felt like miles, I saw a shape ahead through the trees, the outline of a metal gate. Beyond it, a gravel road stretched into the distance. I nearly cried from relief. I had found my way out. I followed the gravel road until I reached a junction with signs pointing toward a highway. After several more exhausting miles, a car finally appeared, and I was able to flag it down. The driver looked at me with wide eyes, probably seeing how ragged I looked, soaked from the rain, face scratched, clothes dirty. They gave me a ride back to the main town, where I could find. I started my hike early in the morning, before the sun had fully risen. The air was cold and damp, and when I stepped out of my car, I could see my breath hanging in front of me like faint smoke. The lot was nearly empty, just 2 other vehicles parked near the tree line. It gave me a strange feeling, knowing that other people were out there somewhere in the woods, but that I might not see them all day. The trail I had chosen was long, over 10 miles one way, and most people avoided it because of how rough it became near the top. That was exactly what drew me to it. I wanted the isolation, the challenge, and the feeling of being away from everything for a while. I tightened the straps of my backpack, making sure the weight was balanced, and then locked the car. The gravel crunched under my boots as I made my way to the start of the trail. The first mile was wide and well-worn, a path that could almost pass for a dirt road. The trees on both sides were tall pines, their trunks lined up in rows, blocking out most of the light. Birds called from high branches, and somewhere off in the distance, I could hear the faint rush of water, probably from a stream or a small waterfall. For the first hour, the hike was pleasant. My body was warming up, and the movement felt good. The path curved gently upward, and I got into a steady rhythm with my steps. The smell of pine needles and damp soil filled the air, and every once in a while I stopped to drink from my water bottle and adjust my jacket. My pack wasn't too heavy, just food, extra layers, a headlamp, first aid kit, and a small emergency bivy sack, but I could feel it pressing on my shoulders. As I climbed higher, the trail grew narrower. Roots crossed the dirt like veins, forcing me to watch my footing. The forest also grew thicker, and the sound of the rushing water faded. I began to feel more alone, the silence only broken by the crunch of my boots and the occasional rustle of leaves when a squirrel darted through the undergrowth. By late morning, the trail became rougher. The slope steepened, and rocks jutted out of the ground, forming uneven steps. I paused more often, catching my breath and taking long sips of water. Sweat gathered at the base of my neck despite the cool air. The higher I climbed, the more rugged the landscape became, with fallen trees blocking the path and forcing me to step over them or find ways around. I reached a small clearing around noon. The sun was higher now, beams of light breaking through the trees. I set my pack down on a flat rock and pulled out some food, dried fruit, trail mix, and a granola bar. The quiet pressed in heavily, and I realized I hadn't heard a bird in a while. The forest seemed still, as if it was watching me. I told myself it was only in my head, just the effect of being alone for hours, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence was heavier than before. After eating, I pressed on. The trail narrowed even more and began hugging the side of a steep slope. To my right, the ground dropped sharply into a tangle of trees and rocks below. The soil was loose in places, and I had to test each step before putting my full weight down. The backpack pulled me slightly backward, and I kept imagining how easy it would be to lose balance. My heart raced each time the dirt slid under my boots, even if it was only a small slip. The air grew colder as the elevation increased. My legs burned from the constant climb, and I could feel blisters starting to form on my heels. I pushed on, wanting to reach a ridge I had seen on the map. It was supposed to offer a wide view of the valley, and I told myself I'd rest there before deciding whether to turn back or continue to the summit. By the time I reached the ridge, the sky had turned gray. Clouds had rolled in from the west, covering the sun and throwing the forest into a dull shadow. I set my pack down and stood at the edge, looking out. The valley stretched far below, covered in trees that seemed endless, a rolling sea of green and gray. In the distance, I could just make out the faint line of the road I had driven on that morning. For the first time, the isolation hit me harder than before. I was far from anyone, deep in the wilderness, with only the trail connecting me to safety. I didn't rest long. The wind had picked up, and the air felt colder. I adjusted my jacket and kept moving. The trail beyond the ridge was rougher than anything before it. Rocks the size of small boulders littered the path, and the slope became steeper. I climbed carefully, my boots slipping occasionally on damp moss. My hands scraped against tree trunks and stone as I pulled myself upward. It was mid-afternoon when I realized how tired I had become. My legs felt heavy, and my stomach growled even though I had eaten only a few hours earlier. I stopped, dropped my pack, and dug out another granola bar. I chewed slowly, listening. The silence was deeper now, almost suffocating. I strained my ears but heard nothing. No birds, no wind in the branches, not even the distant rush of water anymore. When I started walking again, the unease grew. The trail twisted sharply along another slope, this one steeper and more dangerous than before. The drop-off to my right was sheer, and the ground was damp from earlier rains. I placed each step carefully, my hands brushing the rocks on the left side of the trail for balance. At one point, the dirt crumbled under my boot, and I felt myself lurch toward the edge. My heart hammered as I dropped to a crouch, grabbing at the ground until I steadied myself. The thought of slipping and tumbling down the slope sent a shiver through me. I forced myself to keep going, but the trail only grew worse. In places, it narrowed so much that I had to turn sideways to squeeze past rock walls. My pack scraped against the stone, and I could feel the edge of the drop only inches from my boots. I told myself I'd turn back soon, but each time I thought of it, I told myself just a little further, maybe the path would widen again. Didn't. The clouds overhead thickened, and the light dimmed as if evening was approaching faster than it should. I checked my watch. It was only 4, but the forest already felt darker. I knew I didn't have much time before I'd need to use my headlamp, and the thought of navigating this terrain in the dark made my stomach tighten. I decided to push just far enough to find a safer spot to rest, maybe a clearing or a flat stretch of trail. That was when I noticed something strange. The ground had fresh marks, scratches in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged along the trail. They weren't from boots. I knew what boot prints looked like. These were wider, uneven, as if someone had pulled a large bag or object. The marks veered off toward the slope at one point but continued again a few feet later. My chest tightened as I studied them. I told myself it could be nothing. Maybe a fallen log had been moved. Maybe an animal had left the marks. But deep down, I felt unsettled. I quickened my pace, wanting to get away from that spot. The trail curved again, and suddenly I came to a section that made my stomach drop. The path had crumbled away, leaving only a narrow strip of dirt against the rock wall. The drop on the other side was sheer, falling at least 50 feet into jagged rocks. I hesitated, my breath catching. Crossing it would be dangerous, but turning back meant retracing the long, difficult trail I had already covered. I stood there for a long moment, weighing my choices, the silence pressing in harder than ever. I had been planning the hike for weeks, maybe even months if I counted how long the idea sat in the back of my mind before I finally committed. The Ridge Trail wasn't a famous one, but it had a reputation among locals for being tough, long, and quiet. That's exactly what I wanted. Something that would push me physically and mentally, away from crowds and away from my usual patterns. It was the middle of September when I set out. The weather had started to cool, the leaves along the lower slopes were beginning to turn, and the air in the mornings carried that faint sharpness that told you summer was over. I packed heavier than I probably needed, stuffing my backpack with extra water, food, first aid, a headlamp, and a lightweight emergency bivvy. My plan was to finish in one day, but I always carried extra gear because I had learned the hard way that unexpected things happen when you're miles from the nearest road. The trail began gently, through wide meadows with golden grass and scattered trees. The ground was still damp with dew, and my boots darkened as I brushed through patches of wet grass. I could hear distant birds calling in the trees and the faint hum of insects. The sky was pale blue, streaked with thin clouds. It all felt calm, and I settled into a steady pace. The first hours were easy. The trail wound upward slowly, climbing in long switchbacks through stands of pine and aspen. I noticed the air thinning as I climbed higher, but I was still comfortable. My legs burned a little, but in a satisfying way. Every now and then, I stopped to drink water and eat a handful of trail mix. By midday, I reached the halfway point. The trees had thinned, the wind picked up, and the ground grew rockier. The ridge was above me now, steep and jagged, stretching for miles. The trail narrowed to little more than a path scratched into the side of the slope. On one side, the ground rose in a sharp wall of stone. On the other side, it fell away into a valley that seemed far deeper than it really was. I felt the first hint of unease then. It wasn't fear exactly, just the awareness that I was very alone, very far from anything familiar, and that one wrong step would be enough to put me in serious trouble. I tightened the straps of my backpack and pushed on. The trail climbed sharply after that. My breathing grew heavier, and I had to stop more often. Sweat soaked through my shirt, cooled by the wind as soon as I paused. Loose rocks shifted under my boots, clattering down the slope when I misplaced my step. I tried not to look too long at the valley below, focusing instead on each movement forward. Hours slipped by like that. Steady climbing, stopping to rest, drinking water, chewing dry granola bars. The sun had shifted to the west now, casting longer shadows across the ridge. The temperature began to drop, and I felt the first chill in the air. I knew I needed to make the far end of the ridge before sunset. That's when things started to go wrong. It began with the sound of rocks sliding somewhere above me. I froze, staring up at the steep slope. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a small stone bounced onto the trail just ahead, rolling off the edge. I scanned the slope but saw no animals, no movement. Maybe it had been loose and gave way on its own. I told myself not to overthink it, but my nerves sharpened. A little further on, I noticed how faint the trail became. In some places it was clear, packed dirt marked by boot prints, but in others it nearly disappeared under scree and loose gravel. I followed what I thought was the right way, but doubts crept in. The mountains all looked the same when I glanced around, sharp and gray and endless. At one point, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in over an hour. My stomach tightened. I stopped, took off my pack, and pulled out the map. According to it, the trail should run directly along the ridgeline, but I couldn't tell if I had drifted too low. I tried to match the map with the peaks I could see, but everything blurred together in the fading light. I decided to keep going upward, figuring that if I regained the top of the ridge, I could reorient myself. That was easier said than done. The slope grew steeper, the rocks looser. Every step sent gravel sliding under my boots. My calves ached from the strain, and my breathing turned ragged. I felt the weight of my pack dragging me back. By the time I reached what looked like the top, the sun was low, painting the peaks in deep orange. The wind was colder now, strong enough to push at my balance. I dropped to my knees and crawled the last few feet to a flat section of rock, my hands scraping against stone. When I stood and looked around, my stomach dropped again. The ridge stretched in both directions, but I had no idea which way was correct. The trail, if it had been there at all, was gone. All I saw was bare rock, patches of loose scree, and cliffs falling away on either side. Panic flickered at the edges of my thoughts, but I forced it down. I told myself I had options. I had a headlamp, food, and enough gear to last the night if I had to. But the idea of staying up there alone, exposed to the wind and dropping temperatures, made my chest feel tight. I picked a direction and started walking. The rock under my boots was uneven and sharp. Several times I slipped, catching myself just in time. My thighs trembled from exhaustion, and my lips felt dry even though I kept sipping water. As darkness fell, I put on the headlamp. The beam cut through the gloom, showing me little more than the ground in front of my boots. Shadows stretched in every direction, and beyond the reach of the light, the mountains loomed black and endless. The cold deepened fast. I pulled on a jacket from my pack, but the wind cut through the fabric. My fingers felt stiff, my face raw. I stumbled once and nearly went down hard, my pack pulling me sideways toward the edge. The jolt of fear shot through me so strong that I had to stop and breathe, kneeling on the cold rock while my heart pounded. I realized then that I wasn't going to make it off the ridge that night. My body was too tired, and I couldn't risk moving blindly in the dark. I found a spot where the rock dipped slightly inward, forming a shallow alcove, and decided to wait out the night there. I sat with my back against the stone, pulling the emergency bivvy around me. It crinkled loudly in the wind, but it trapped some warmth. The hours dragged. I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me flinch. The wind howled through the rocks, and I kept hearing the shifting sound of gravel sliding, like footsteps too far away to see. My imagination twisted every sound into something threatening. By morning, I was stiff, cold, and sore. My mouth felt dry, my stomach empty. The sun rose slowly, lighting the peaks in pale gold. I forced myself up, shaking off the bivvy, and started moving again. I followed the ridge for hours, always hoping to see some sign of the trail, a marker, or even another hiker. But the mountains remained empty. My water ran lower, and each swallow felt heavier with the knowledge that it wouldn't last forever. By mid-afternoon, I stumbled onto a faint path winding downward. Relief washed over me so strong that I nearly cried. I followed it carefully, my legs weak but driven by hope. The path led me into a narrow canyon. The walls rose high on either side, blocking the wind. It was warmer there, and the sound of running water echoed faintly. I followed it until I reached a stream trickling over smooth rocks. I dropped to my knees and filled my bottle, drinking until my stomach ached. I rested there, gathering strength, before continuing down. The canyon widened, and soon I saw signs of people again. An old fire ring, boot prints in the dirt. My chest loosened for the first time in nearly 2 days. By evening, I reached a dirt road. Not long after, I heard the distant sound of a vehicle. When I finally walked out onto the road and saw headlights approaching, I knew I was safe. The hike had started as something simple, something I thought I could control. But the ridge reminded me how small I really was out there, how quickly things could turn. I had made it back, but I knew I wouldn't forget the sound of rocks sliding in the dark or the feeling of standing lost on a mountain ridge with nothing but shadows in every direction. I had been hiking alone for years, but there was something different about this trip. I chose a place that wasn't very popular, a trail tucked away in a remote mountain region. I found it on an old map, the kind of trail that didn't appear in the glossy brochures or the hiking apps most people use. I liked the idea of being somewhere quiet, away from the usual crowds. I wanted peace, just me and the mountains. I started early in the morning. The air was cool, and the ground was damp with dew. My backpack felt heavy, even though I had packed carefully: water, food, first aid kit, flashlight, extra layers, knife, map, compass, and a small tent. The trail was narrow from the beginning, carved into the side of the ridge with steep drop-offs on one side and dense forest pressing against the other. It was one of those trails where you have to place each step carefully, the kind where a misstep means sliding down a slope full of loose rocks. The first hours felt normal. I walked steadily, my boots crunching against gravel and dirt. Birds chirped in the trees, and I could hear water somewhere below, a stream running through the valley. The air smelled of pine and damp soil. My body warmed quickly, and sweat began to gather under my pack straps. I remember pausing often to sip water and wipe my forehead. I felt good, strong, alive. By midday, the trail grew more rugged. Roots twisted across the ground, and jagged rocks forced me to climb more than walk. The trees thinned in places, exposing sheer cliffs. I could see far into the distance, blue ridges folding one after another like waves. It was beautiful, but the beauty had sharp edges. There was no one out there. No houses, no signs, no sound of cars, nothing man-made. Just wilderness stretching forever. I kept moving, following the faded markers nailed to trees. After several hours, I reached a part of the trail where the ridge narrowed into a knife edge. The path was barely wider than my boots, loose gravel on one side and a wall of rock on the other. The drop was dizzying. I stood there a while, steadying my breathing, telling myself to stay calm. My legs felt heavy, and I could hear my heart in my ears. Crossing that section was slow. I leaned against the rock wall, inching forward. My palms scraped against the stone, and my boots slid on gravel that trickled off the edge. When I finally reached safer ground, my legs were trembling. I sat for a while to calm down, drinking water and eating a protein bar. I remember staring back at that ridge, wondering why I had chosen this place. The afternoon sun grew harsher. Heat shimmered off the rocks, and the air felt dry. I began to feel the weight of every step. My shoulders ached under the straps. My socks were damp, and my feet rubbed against the inside of my boots. I stopped often, checking the map. According to it, I still had miles to go before reaching the small clearing where I had planned to camp. That was when I noticed something strange. The trail markings grew less frequent. The paint on rocks had faded, and some trees that once held markers had fallen long ago. At one point, I reached a fork where two faint paths split in different directions, neither clearly marked. I pulled out the map, but it didn't show the fork. I tried to think logically, studying the slope of the land, the position of the sun. I chose the left path, thinking it seemed more worn. At first it seemed fine. The path sloped gently downhill, and I felt relief to be moving easily again. But soon it narrowed more and more, swallowed by brush and low branches. My arms scraped against thorns, and my legs were scratched raw by hidden sticks. The ground grew muddy, sucking at my boots. I began to doubt myself, but I didn't want to backtrack. I told myself it had to connect again to the main trail. The forest grew darker as the sun dipped behind the ridges. I realized how late it was getting. My pace quickened, but the path only grew worse. It twisted downward into a ravine, rocks jutting out at odd angles, roots snaking across the ground. My ankle rolled once, and I nearly fell. My heart raced. I knew I needed to stop soon and set up camp, but the ground was too uneven. When I finally found a small flat spot, I dropped my pack and sat heavily. My body shook with exhaustion. I set up the tent quickly, my fingers fumbling with the poles. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. No wind, no birds, no insects, just stillness. It made me uneasy. As darkness fell, I cooked a small meal on my stove, the flame flickering weakly in the still air. The food tasted bland, but I forced myself to eat. My throat felt dry, even though I drank plenty of water. My body was drained, but my mind wouldn't rest. I lay in my tent, staring at the fabric glowing faintly with moonlight. Every sound outside seemed louder than it should be. A twig snapping, leaves shifting. I told myself it was just animals, but my chest felt tight. Sleep came in restless fragments. I woke often, sweating in my bag, listening to silence. At one point, I thought I heard something move near my tent, like soft steps on the ground. I held my breath until my lungs ached, then slowly exhaled. Nothing happened. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Morning came gray and heavy. My body ached, and my face felt swollen from poor sleep. I packed quickly, my hands trembling with urgency. I just wanted to find the trail again, to get out of this maze of trees and rocks. I climbed out of the ravine, pushing through thick brush. Branches whipped against my face, leaving thin cuts. My clothes were damp with sweat and dew. Hours passed, and I realized I was lost. The ground sloped unpredictably, leading me in circles. I pulled out the compass again and again, trying to head east where I knew a road eventually ran, but the forest twisted me around. Every ridge looked the same, every hollow like the last. My map was useless now. It didn't show these faint trails and gullies. The day dragged on. My legs burned with every climb. My water ran low. I rationed what was left, sipping only enough to wet my tongue. Hunger gnawed at me, but fear was stronger. My skin burned under the sun, and my lips cracked. The silence pressed in until I felt like I could scream. By late afternoon, I stumbled into a dry creek bed. The rocks were smooth and pale, and the steep sides boxed me in. I followed it, hoping it would lead to water or an opening. Instead, it narrowed into a canyon of sharp stone. The walls grew taller, casting long shadows. The air turned cooler, but the path became harder, the rocks sharp against my boots. That was when I noticed something again. Footprints. Faint impressions in the dust and sand of the creek bed. At first I felt relief, proof that someone else had been here. But then the fear returned. The prints were old, edges crumbling, and they weren't heading out, they were leading deeper into the canyon. I followed them anyway. Desperation drove me. My legs shook, and my throat burned, but I kept moving. The canyon grew darker until I had to take out my flashlight. The beam cut across stone walls, lighting cracks and shadows. My stomach knotted tighter with every step. The footprints ended at a pile of rocks, as if whoever made them had climbed out of the canyon. I tried to scramble up too, but the stones shifted under my weight. My hands scraped raw, dust filling my nose and mouth. I slid back down, coughing. My chest heaved with panic. I kept moving forward instead. The canyon narrowed until it was barely wider than my shoulders. I had to squeeze sideways, my pack scraping against stone. My breathing grew ragged, echoing in the tight space. I felt trapped, buried alive. Finally, it opened again into a wider chamber, a hollow carved by water long ago. I dropped my pack and collapsed onto the ground. My body shook with exhaustion. I drank the last of my water, knowing it wasn't enough. My mouth still felt like sand. I spent that night in the canyon. The air was freezing. I curled in my bag, shivering uncontrollably. The stone beneath me sucked the heat from my body. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw images of endless walls and dead ends. My chest tightened with the thought of never leaving. The next morning, I forced myself up, numb and weak. My legs barely carried me. I stumbled on sharp rocks, cutting my palms when I fell. My vision blurred from dehydration. Still, I kept going, dragging my body through the canyon. Then I heard it, faint at first, then clearer. The sound of running water. I staggered forward, heart pounding with hope. I rounded a bend, and there it was, a thin stream trickling from the rock, pooling in a shallow basin. I dropped to my knees, scooping water into my mouth. Tasted like metal and earth, but it was life. I drank until my stomach cramped. With strength returning, I followed the stream downhill. The canyon walls opened slowly, light growing brighter. Trees reappeared, then wider. I always thought hiking was one of the safest ways to clear my head. I had done countless trails in different states, some with friends, some alone, and even though I had my share of small scares, like hearing coyotes at night or slipping on wet rocks, I had never experienced anything that truly made me fear for my life. That changed when I decided to take a long solo hike deep into the backcountry of a national forest in late summer. The plan was simple. I had a week off work, and I wanted to disconnect. I carried my tent, food, water filter, stove, a knife, headlamp, extra batteries, and a map. My backpack was heavy but manageable. The weather had been hot during the day but cooler at night. I knew how to handle myself outdoors, and I thought I had planned well. The trail I picked wasn't one of the most popular ones, which was what I wanted. I was tired of crowded campgrounds and noisy groups. I wanted quiet and solitude, and I found it. But the deeper I went, the more I realized solitude cuts both ways. The first day was normal. I parked my car at the trailhead early in the morning, shouldered my pack, and began the hike. The trail started wide and well used, but after a few miles, it narrowed and began weaving through denser forest. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The sunlight came down in patches through the canopy. I saw deer tracks in the dirt, squirrels running up trees, and heard woodpeckers hammering somewhere far off. By afternoon, I reached a ridge where the view opened up, and I could see endless layers of forested hills stretching toward the horizon. I set up camp near a small stream, cooked some noodles, and watched the sky turn orange and then purple as the sun went down. Everything felt right. The second day was harder. The trail climbed sharply, and the air was humid. Sweat soaked my shirt and made my backpack straps rub against my shoulders. The forest grew thicker, and I saw fewer signs of people. The only human trace I noticed was an old fire ring made from stones, half buried in moss, like no one had touched it in years. By midday, I felt far from the world I knew. My phone had no signal, which I expected. I didn't care. That was the point. That night, things shifted. I camped in a small clearing. The ground was uneven, but I managed to find a flat spot for my tent. After eating, I sat outside, listening to the woods. At first, it was the usual nighttime chorus: crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then, I noticed it go silent, not for long, but long enough to make me freeze. The forest has rhythms, and you get used to them when you spend time outside. Silence means something. I told myself it was a predator passing by, maybe a fox or even a bear, though I saw no signs. After 10 minutes, the crickets started again, and I tried to relax, but the unease stuck with me as I crawled into my tent. I woke up once in the night to a faint crunch of leaves. My heart jumped. It was close. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. I waited for what felt like forever, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, expecting a shadow to pass across it. Nothing came. I didn't unzip the tent. I stayed still until I eventually drifted off again, though it was a light, restless sleep. The third day, I pushed farther. The trail was rougher now, more overgrown, harder to follow. Fallen branches and thick undergrowth forced me to slow down. The map showed a small lake a few miles ahead, and that was my goal. By afternoon, I reached it. The water was calm, reflecting the clouds above. It should have been peaceful, but something about the place felt off. There were no birds, no insects buzzing near the shore, not even frogs croaking. It was too still. I filled my bottles using the filter, cooked a meal, and set up camp a short distance from the water. I kept looking over my shoulder, though I couldn't say why. I had the sense I was being watched, though logic told me I wasn't. That night, I heard the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, crunching through dry leaves. I sat up, heart pounding, gripping my knife in one hand. The steps circled, moving in and out of range. I told myself it was a deer, maybe even more than one, but it didn't sound like that. Deer move differently. This sounded like a person walking, careful but not careful enough. The steps stopped, then nothing. I didn't sleep much. By the fourth day, I was tired. My legs ached, and the lack of sleep was catching up to me. I decided I would only go a little farther before turning back. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I packed up quickly and left the lake behind. The trail wound up through dense woods, the trees so thick they blocked most of the sunlight. At one point, I noticed something strange. A footprint in the mud, not an animal print, but a boot tread, old, worn, but clear. It wasn't mine. It was facing the same direction I was going. My chest tightened. I hadn't seen a soul since starting this hike. Who had been here? How long ago? I scanned the ground and saw more prints, fading into the brush. I followed the trail carefully, but the prints eventually disappeared. That night, I camped on a ridge. The view was wide, but the wind was strong. I thought the openness would make me feel safer, but it didn't. As the dark came down, I noticed something below. Faint smoke rising from the trees, far off but visible against the dimming sky. Someone else was out here. My stomach twisted. I had a choice: move closer and find out, or stay put. I stayed. I lay in my tent, staring upward, listening. The night dragged on. Around midnight, I swore I heard something moving up the ridge, faint at first, then closer. I lay frozen, gripping my knife again. The movement stopped a short distance away, then nothing. No retreat, no further approach, just silence. I hardly slept. On the fifth day, I turned back. I didn't care about finishing the loop anymore. I wanted out. The forest, once a place of peace, now felt hostile. Every sound made me flinch. My pace was quick, almost frantic. I barely stopped to eat. My mind kept replaying the footsteps at night, the smoke, the prints in the mud. That evening, I reached the stream where I had camped on the first night. Relief washed over me for a moment because it felt familiar, but it didn't last. I set up camp and tried to calm myself, but as the night deepened, I saw something that froze my blood. Across the stream, near the trees, I noticed movement. A figure stood there, just barely visible in the fading light. Not close enough to see details, but close enough to know it was a person. They didn't move. They just stood watching. My heart pounded so hard I thought I would faint. I blinked, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. I couldn't tell if they stepped back into the woods or if my eyes had tricked me, but the fear was real. I didn't sleep that night at all. At dawn, I packed without eating and pushed forward. I knew the trailhead was still miles away, but the thought of my car kept me going. My legs were heavy, my throat dry, my body exhausted, but adrenaline carried me. By midday, I started recognizing the terrain. The trail widened. Relief grew, but so did my paranoia. Every time I looked behind me, I felt I would see someone following. Once, I thought I heard steps matching mine, stopping when I stopped, but when I spun around, there was nothing. When I finally saw the parking lot, my chest nearly burst with relief. My car was there, untouched. The lot was empty except for me. I dropped my pack into the trunk, climbed in, and locked the doors. My hands shook as I turned the key. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced into the mirror. The forest loomed behind me, endless and dark, and I swore I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, still and silent, as if watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main highway. Even then, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see headlights tailing me or a shape in the back seat. Of course, there was nothing, but the fear stayed. Days later, I still felt it. I never saw another hiker out there, never confirmed who or what had followed me, if anyone had at all. Maybe it was real, maybe it was exhaustion twisting my senses. But the footprints were real. The smoke was real. The figure by the stream was real. Someone was out there and they wanted me to know it. I haven't gone on a solo hike since.